A little girl, no older than 7, emerges from a black sport utility vehicle. Her eyes immediately find the most feared man in the entire district, and she forms a silent message with her lips. He is not my dad. The Mafia leader gives no visible reaction. Instead, he turns, maneuvers his own car to completely block the only way out, and cuts the power. He does this because, in his territory, using a child for leverage is a line you do not get to cross and then walk away from. If that image captured your attention, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the stories we have coming. I have another tale you will not forget ready for tomorrow. Before we continue, leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from. I truly enjoy seeing our audience span the globe. This is a story about what happens when the most dangerous man in the city meets a child brave enough to ask him for help, and how one silent moment in a parking lot changed everything he believed about power, mercy, and what it means to protect someone. If you have ever wondered whether people are capable of real change, this story will give you your answer. Now, let us return to the story.
The commercial plaza off K Meridian never felt like a place where destinies were decided. It was a place of wide asphalt paths, plain office buildings, a large parking garage at one end, and a single narrow exit lane that funneled traffic back onto the main thoroughfare. On a Thursday evening, as the light began to fade, the parking lot contained about 30 cars and the types of people you would expect to own them. There were businessmen walking back to their sedans, and a delivery worker arranging boxes near a service entrance. Two women dressed for an office were moving quickly, their heads bowed. Every person was absorbed in their own world. No one was paying attention. It was that kind of anonymous street. Valentino had arrived because his partner needed a couple of minutes to complete a quick exchange. It was nothing important. He had exited the vehicle from the passenger side and stood near the exit, mainly because he had always felt a deep unease in enclosed areas. He remained perfectly still as the world bustled around him, and that profound stillness was enough to make other people subconsciously change their course to avoid him. He was 41 years old, with a lean frame that held a certain weight, a density forged through years of methodical violence and unforgiving self-control. His suit was black and tailored to fit him precisely, worn without a tie. The collar of his shirt was open at the top button. Tattoos were visible on his skin. They climbed from under the collar of his shirt. Dark, intricate designs snaked up the left side of his neck, looping behind his ear and extending toward his jawline. His hands were covered in ink from the knuckles all the way to his wrists, the patterns thick and purposeful. He appeared to be exactly what he was, and because of that, nearly everyone on that street had already made an unconscious choice to give him a very wide berth. He was not actively watching the black sport utility vehicle as it entered the lot. He registered its presence the way he registered everything, on the edge of his awareness, without any particular focus. It was a large vehicle with heavily tinted windows and unofficial license plates, and it was moving with hesitation. It was the way a car moves when the driver is evaluating a situation, not simply looking for a parking spot. The back door on the passenger side opened first. A small girl climbed out onto the pavement. That single detail was what finally captured his full attention. She was very young, maybe 7 or 8 years old. Her blonde hair was untied and fell around her shoulders, catching the final rays of the afternoon sun. She wore a black coat that was a little too big for her small body, with the sleeves hanging down past her hands. She got out of the car and then immediately froze in place. It was not the curious pause of a child who sees something fascinating. It was the absolute, rigid stillness of a child who was obeying a command she had committed to memory. Do not move. Do not make a sound. Do not attract any attention. From behind her, the driver's door swung open. The man who got out was the complete opposite of it was a functional gesture, repositioning her as if she were a piece being set on a game board. Valentino's gaze remained fixed on the pair. The little girl's shoulders were drawn up tight. Her chin was tilted down just a fraction. She was holding her body with the tense caution of a person trying to manage intense fear, not a person who felt at ease. And in the air between her and the man, in the space where comfort and connection should have been, there was nothing but a chilling emptiness. It was not the kind of separation caused by a long day or a fussy child. It was an unnatural void. He could not pinpoint the exact moment she saw him. Perhaps it was the way he stood without motion while the rest of the world around him was in constant flux. Or maybe it was something more primal. That unspoken, animal sense that even small children possess, the feeling that someone is watching, and watching in a different way. She lifted her head, and her eyes found his across the expanse of asphalt, without any need to search. Her look was completely steady. Her eyes were not wide with tears, as you might expect from a child about to break down. They were not filled with panic or desperation. They were the eyes of someone who had already considered and dismissed every other possibility, arriving at her last resort with a terrifying kind of focus. She held his stare for one very deliberate moment, and then formed 3 words with her mouth. "He is not my dad." There was no theatrical display, no reaching out, and no outward sign of her terror that might have tipped off the man standing beside her. It was a communication that was quiet, exact, and filled with a trust that can only come from a person who has absolutely nothing more to lose by taking a chance on a total stranger. Valentino's face remained a mask. It did not change at all. But on the inside, something clicked into place with a quiet, final sound. It was the same internal process that had kept him alive for 20 years, in rooms where a single misjudgment could lead to a fatal outcome. He had carefully built a fearsome reputation on the idea that feelings were a weakness and compassion was a tool for negotiation, not an instinct. But this situation was not a negotiation. This was a child, standing in his city, on his territory, next to a man whose hand on her shoulder had revealed everything Valentino needed to know long before she had uttered a sound. He looked at her for just one more second. Then, he turned around, walked back to his own car, and eased into the driver's seat. He drove forward slowly, turning the large vehicle sideways to completely block the narrow exit lane. He then killed the engine and left the door open. He stepped out again and stood next to his car, his hands hanging relaxed at his sides, and he waited. The man in the white shirt saw it happen right away. He stopped walking, his eyes going from the blocked lane to Valentino. Valentino simply stared back. Neither of them spoke a word yet, but in the space that separated them, in the golden, dusty light of that quiet commercial lot, a resolution had already been reached. The little girl stood between them, small and still, watching. And for the very first time since she had stepped out of that vehicle, her shoulders relaxed just a tiny bit, moving from a position high up by her ears to a place much closer to where they were supposed to be. But to truly, after Clara's mother was gone, Raphael had to become everything. He was the one packing school lunches and attempting to braid her hair into something that did not look like a mess. He read bedtime stories with words he stumbled over, just to hear the sound of her laughing at his silly voices. He was a good man, not a lawbreaker, but 3 years of struggling to stay afloat will make anyone grab for something that even resembles a lifeline. Armani Douglas found him the way predators always find the desperate, through the wide, empty space between what a person needs and what the world will let them have. The very first job had been straightforward. He had to deliver a package. He was not to open it. He was not to ask questions. It was $3,000 for 40 minutes behind the wheel. Raphael convinced himself it was a single, necessary compromise in a time of impossible pressure. He told himself that again as he deposited the cash, and as he paid the overdue power bill. He repeated it while buying Clara brand new shoes and watching her face light up when he finally said yes to that school trip she had long given up on. He told himself many things. The second job came not long after, and then the third one followed. Each task was a little bigger, and each one became a little harder to deny. By the time Raphael finally understood the true weight of the world he had entered, Armani Douglas was no longer a choice. He was a crushing obligation. The assignment that changed everything was unlike the others. Armani had explained it in his usual simple way. He laid out all the details while leaning back in his chair, completely unhurried, as if they were discussing the weather and not a moment that could never be undone. A man needed to be intercepted. He was not to be harmed, Armani had insisted, with the kind of polished smoothness that people use when a word is a polite suggestion, not a real promise. The man just had to be stopped, delayed for a while. Raphael's only job was to drive. Two other men would take care of everything else that followed. Raphael listened carefully to the entire explanation, and then he said no. It was not because he suddenly found a new source of courage. It was not because some perfect moral clarity washed over him. He said no because the man Armani was describing had 3 children, and some deep part of Raphael, a part that had somehow survived every other terrible compromise, simply refused to cross that line. Armani just nodded his head very slowly. "I will give you until tomorrow morning to reconsider," he said. He never raised his voice. He made no direct threats. He simply got to his feet, straightened the lapels of his jacket, and walked out of the room. That night, Raphael held Clara as she slept, and he knew with absolute dread that his refusal was going to cost him something dear. He just had not yet understood that it would cost him his daughter. The next morning, Clara was gone. There was no broken lock, no sign of a struggle at all. She was simply not in her bed anymore, her small body replaced by a strange cell phone he did not own. A single message glowed on the screen. "Reconsider. You have 72 hours. She is perfectly safe as long as you are cooperative." For a moment that stretched into an eternity, Raphael forgot how to breathe. Then he dialed the only number he had for Armani and said, his voice completely broken, that he would do anything that was asked of him. Armani's reply was calm, measured, almost gentle. "I know you will," he said, "but not right now. Let the weight of this settle in first. We will talk again tomorrow." Then the line went dead. For a very long time after that, Raphael just sat on the floor next to Clara's empty bed. Her favorite stuffed rabbit was still resting on her pillow. The glass of water she asked for the night before sat on the small table, with barely a sip taken. It was all just ordinary proof of a child who had been right there only hours ago and who now was not. He had put her in this danger, not Armani. He had done this with every single job he had quietly tried to justify. Every package he told himself was nothing important. Every line he had redrawn with his own conscience in the quiet of the night. It had all added up to this exact morning, on this exact floor, in this exact and overwhelming absence. He whispered her name into the silence, just once, as if some part of his mind had not yet accepted what the empty bed had already proven. The apartment gave him no answer. He had seen her only one time since that day. Armani had allowed it, a brief and calculated meeting, the way someone might show proof that a valuable item is still in their possession without ever letting go of it. It happened in a parking lot during the day. Clara was brought out just long enough for Raphael to see that she was not hurt, and then she was led away before he could even take a step toward her. She had looked at him across the cracked asphalt with those incredibly steady eyes of hers. She did not cry. That was the detail that he could not get out of his mind. She did not cry or reach for him or fall apart. She just looked at him with the composed, heartbreaking face of a child who is keeping a promise. "I will do what you told me, Dad. I am being good. I am waiting." Through his own tears, the night before she was taken, he had told her to always trust him. He had told her to follow his instructions, to be brave. She was doing all 3 of those things, and the sight of it was absolutely destroying him. By the 3rd day, Raphael had given up on eating. He just sat in the anonymous room where Armani's men had put him, in some building in a part of the city he did not recognize. He ran through the same terrible calculation over and over, and he always got the same answer. There was no scenario where doing what they said would keep her safe forever. Men like Armani did not give up their leverage. They used it, and when it was no longer useful, they found something even worse. The only way out he could imagine was himself. He would turn himself in to the police, offer them complete cooperation against whatever forces Armani feared, and give them everything he knew. He would trade names, locations, and every last detail in exchange for Clara being returned safely to her grandmother's house before nightfall. He was mentally rehearsing that exact offer, getting the words right in his head. That was when Armani's man knocked on the door and told him it was time to get dressed. They were taking Clara to the K Meridian lot. There was someone important Armani had to meet there. Raphael squeezed his eyes shut. Just hold on, he thought, trying to send the message across the city with his mind. I am going to fix this. He did not know that someone else had already arrived to fix it for him. Armani Douglas was not a man who ever panicked. Panic was for men without a plan, and Armani always had a plan. He planned things like an architect, with layers and contingencies, with backups for his backups. Every deal he ever made had a clear exit strategy. Every person he ever controlled had a counterweight. Every man he ever squeezed had eventually found their way to the same place. Compliance. He was not used to standing in a parking lot while someone else's car blocked his only way out. For 3 entire seconds, he did absolutely nothing. He stood next to his sport utility vehicle, one hand resting on the door, and just looked at the car that was now parked sideways across the narrow exit lane. It was so unhurried, almost casual in its placement, which somehow felt much worse than open aggression. He understood aggression. He could read the temperature of a fight and respond accordingly. This was different. This was cold and deliberate. He looked at the man who was standing next to the blocking car. He wore a black suit with no tie. Tattoos snaked up his neck, reaching for his jaw and covering his hands, clear even in the fading afternoon light. The man was lean, still, and looking right back at Armani with an expression that held no anger, no challenge, and no posturing. He was simply waiting. Armani had been around dangerous people long enough to know the vast difference between a man acting powerful and a man who truly possessed it. The ones who performed were loud, with raised voices and visible weapons, relying on obvious intimidation. The ones who actually held power stood precisely like this man was standing now. An unfamiliar and uncomfortable feeling tightened in Armani's chest. He hid it instantly, letting out a short, dismissive laugh. That was a controlled sound. "You do know you are blocking the lane," he called out. The man offered no response. Armani stood up straighter, adjusted his expensive jacket, and took 3 steps forward, leaving Clara standing alone by the vehicle. That was its own kind of message. She was not a concern to him. She was an object, and objects did not need to be watched. "I do not know what you think you are doing here," Armani said, much closer now, his voice dropping to the low register he always used to signal a serious shift in the conversation. "But you are going to want to move that car of yours right now." The man just looked at him for a long moment. "Is that your daughter?" he finally asked. His voice was quiet and unhurried. It was the kind of quiet that did not require any volume because it already commanded all the space around it. Armani blinked once, thrown off. "That is none of your business," the man replied. "I am asking the girl." The muscles in Armani's jaw went tight. "I said." But the man's attention had already shifted past him. Clara was standing beside the large sport utility vehicle exactly where he had left her, a small and still figure swallowed by the oversized black coat on her shoulders. She had been watching the entire exchange with those careful, composed eyes, analyzing it the way a child learns to read adults when they know a situation can become dangerous in an instant. The man held her gaze steadily. "Is he your father?" he asked her directly. Clara looked at him for one more second, and then she shook her head. It was a single, small, certain movement. The silence that came after that lasted for maybe 3 seconds. For Armani, it felt like a lifetime. Mind your own business. His voice came out sharper than he wanted, a tiny fracture appearing on his controlled surface. Just walk away. Whatever you think you just saw, you did not. The man did not. He pivoted and returned to his car, moving with the same deliberate calm he had shown when he first got out. He leaned inside for a brief, tense moment. Armani's hand twitched, a reflexive gesture toward the weapon concealed in his jacket. But the man emerged holding only a phone. He placed one call, spoke 4 words too quiet for Armani to make out across the space, then slid the device into his pocket. Resting against the hood of the car that imprisoned his own, he crossed his arms and simply waited. This was a clear injustice, a man powerless against an obstacle, but power is meant to protect. Stay with me to see how. Armani retrieved his own phone. He dialed his security team, 2 professionals he paid to remain within a 5-minute response time for this exact kind of problem. They picked up before the second ring. He stated his location in 3 clipped words and disconnected. A wave of reassurance washed over him. Whatever this confrontation was about, it would soon be resolved by superior numbers. With his composure restored, he faced the man again. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he asked. The words were not a question. They were an offer to reconsider a terrible mistake. The man just looked at him. "Yes," he answered, his voice devoid of emotion. Armani gave a slow, deliberate nod. "In that case, you must realize you have made a significant error in judgment." The man's response was another question. "Do you know where you are?" The words did not land as Armani anticipated. It was not the delivery, which remained unnervingly calm and steady. It was what happened next. A car door opened on a vehicle parked 30 meters to his left. A second door opened on his right. Then a third one clicked open behind him, from a car he had not even noticed. The details of his isolation were becoming painfully clear. Men in dark clothing stepped out. Their hands were empty and visible, a detail that was somehow more menacing than drawn weapons. They did not rush forward. They simply emerged, established a perimeter, and stood perfectly still. They were disciplined, synchronized, and profoundly patient. Armani's security team had not arrived. These men were already here. The truth began to dawn on him, rising slowly, and then all at once like the chill of icy water. He was exhausted from a long day, and now fear began to creep in. He was in the wrong part of the city. He knew this district was Valentino Sands' operational base. He knew it as a piece of background information, a fact that existed but had no immediate relevance to his own affairs. He had brought Clara to this specific location for a meeting he couldn't miss. He needed access to something inside the building on this street. The pure logistics of the appointment had guided him here, and in his focus, he had completely overlooked the single most critical detail of the location. This was Valentino Sands' territory. And the man now leaning against the car, observing him with an expression of carved patience, had to be Valentino Sands himself. A laugh escaped Armani's throat. It sounded wrong, a note too high, a beat too quick. He knew it. He was certain Valentino knew it as well. "This is a business matter," Armani stated, his voice tight. "It is a private affair that has no bearing on your organization." Valentino regarded him for a long, silent moment. Then his eyes shifted to Clara. She remained standing beside the SUV exactly where he had left her, enveloped in a coat that was far too large for her small frame. She held herself with a disturbing, practiced stillness. His gaze returned to Armani. "She is 7 years old," Valentino said, each word distinct. Armani replied, "She is collateral." A subtle change occurred behind Valentino's eyes. It was not anger, because anger would have been a more predictable and manageable emotion. This was something colder, something that had already weighed the facts and made a final decision. It was the calm of execution. "No," Valentino said, his voice quiet but absolute. He looked Armani straight in the eye. She is not. He turned his head slightly, issuing a three-word command to the man closest to him. His tone was low and unhurried. The man acknowledged the order with a nod and moved with immediate purpose. Armani's security detail arrived a minute later. They saw the strategic placement of Valentino's men, the blocked escape route, the controlled tension of the scene, and they came to an abrupt halt. From her place by the vehicle, Clara watched it all unfold. She did not speak or move, but deep inside her chest, a knot of terror that had been tightening for 3 days finally loosened, just a fraction. It was like a long sealed door groaning on its hinges, letting in the first sliver of light. Someone had finally heard her silent plea. Valentino had witnessed fear wear countless masks. He had seen it compel men to confess secrets they had buried for decades. He had watched it make others lie with such conviction they almost believed the fabrications themselves. He had seen fear disguise itself as aggression, as apathy, as forced humor, all the costumes it put on to survive in a room full of predators. But he had never seen it worn like this. This child wore her fear quietly, with great care, as if she had folded it into a tiny, neat square and tucked it deep inside herself. It was stored where it would not be a bother to anyone, where it would not call any attention. It would simply wait there, without complaint, until it was no longer needed. The sheer weight of that realization, more than anything else, was what held him in place and commanded his response. He began to walk across the pavement, moving slowly toward her. His focus was not on Armani, who now stood frozen between two of Valentino's men, with the tense stillness of a man frantically reassessing his own survival. He was not focused on the blocked vehicles or the tactical situation to be controlled. He was moving toward her. He came to a stop a few feet away from her and crouched down, not to a full kneel, but low enough. It was enough to bring his face nearer to hers, to reduce the intimidating distance of his presence without invading her space. His instincts told him that closing that gap completely would be a mistake. For 3 days, she had been surrounded by adults making choices for her, crowding her. She did not need another one looming over her. He held his position and waited for her to meet his eyes. When she did, her gaze was steady. Up close, he could see she was even younger than his initial estimate. The ends of her blonde hair were tangled, a clear sign of days without simple domestic care. There had been no one to brush it for her in the morning, no one to make sure she was okay. Her eyes were a pale, clear brown, with faint shadows underneath from a profound lack of sleep. "What is your name?" he asked her. "Clara." Her voice was small but carried a surprising strength. There was a precision in the way she spoke, the careful articulation of a child who had very recently learned that every word has consequences and must be placed with care. "Clara." He repeated her name back to her, not as a question, but as a confirmation that he had heard her. "Where is your father?" A flicker of something crossed her features, a subtle shift like a change in light on the surface of calm water. "He said he would pay," she answered. "He told me to just listen, and he would fix everything." She recited this information with the unwavering fidelity of someone delivering a sacred promise, not her own promise, but his. She was safeguarding it for him, keeping it whole, and presenting it now as proof that the situation was under control, that the agreements were being respected. She was showing him that everything was unfolding exactly as her father had assured her it would. Valentino remained silent for a beat, absorbing her words. "Are you hurt?" he asked next. She simply shook her head. "Has anyone hurt you?" "No." He held her gaze for another second, then slowly rose to his full height. He turned to face Armani. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, the golden hour deepening into amber, casting sharp edges on the dark hood of the SUV, the cracked asphalt, and the stark white of Armani's shirt. Two of Valentino's men flanked Armani, standing at a distance that was close enough to be a clear threat, but just far enough to be deniable. Armani's expression had hardened into something cautious and watchful. Valentino could almost see the numbers turning behind his eyes, the frantic calculation of his position, the risks, and any possible leverage he might still possess. It was the face of a man unsure if he was in a negotiation or a final confrontation, desperately trying to figure out which of those frames would be more survivable. Valentino started walking toward him, his steps slow and measured. "You use a child for leverage," he stated, his voice low. "In my city." The statement hung in the air, not a question needing an answer. Armani's chin lifted a fraction. "This is a private business matter. The girl is perfectly fine. Her father owes a very large debt and has refused to honor his agreement. This is a standard procedure. You brought her here." Valentino's voice remained quiet. It had not risen in volume and would not. "Into this district, to this particular street. You brought a 7-year-old girl into my territory to serve as collateral for a business debt." He stopped walking. "You have a mind for business. This is nothing more than, no." Valentino's voice was like a closing door. It was absolute and irreversible. "This is a sign of weakness." Armani froze completely. "A man who needs a child to collect his debts," Valentino went on, "has no real power. He has only shown his vulnerability." He tilted his head just so. "Surely you grasp the distinction. You are meddling in affairs that are not your concern. They became my concern the moment you came to my street." Armani's jaw flexed. Valentino could see him scrambling for a new position. He was desperately searching for a way to reframe the situation, to find some ground he could use to push back. Men of Armani's type always require an advantage. They grow agitated when they cannot find one. "Are you asking for a cut?" Armani finally blurted out. "Fine. Whatever Raphael owes you, I will give you a share." "If I end your life right here," Valentino asked in a low voice, "who will be left to collect anything at all?" The question of the debt hung in the air, arriving without preamble and settling with heavy finality. Armani's words died in his throat. For a long moment, the parking lot was utterly silent. Far away, a car drifted down the boulevard. A door slammed shut somewhere in the concrete garage. These were the mundane sounds of a normal afternoon, unfolding with no idea of the events taking place in this one small corner. Armani's eyes darted to the men who now surrounded him. He glanced at his own security detail, who stood paralyzed at the edge of the confrontation. They were frozen like men who had quickly done the math and discovered the outcome was not in their favor. The numbers were wrong, and he was acutely aware of it. The swagger did not vanish from his face instantly. Instead, it retreated. It was like a tide pulling back slowly, then all at once, revealing something more ancient and truthful beneath. Valentino turned his back on him. He gave a look to the closest of his associates, a large, silent man who had served him for 11 years and had long ago learned to understand commands from his boss's posture alone. "Find the father," Valentino ordered. "His name is Rafael Flores. Do whatever is necessary. Find him tonight." The man gave a single sharp nod, and then he was gone. Valentino turned his gaze back to Clara. She remained in the exact same spot, swallowed by the coat that was far too big for her, her pale, lucid, and weary eyes fixed on him. He met her gaze for a second. "You have done very well," he told her, his voice soft and direct. At those words, something in Clara's face, in the meticulously composed shield she had built around herself, finally fractured. It was a tiny crack, but it was there. Her chin quivered for a brief moment before she tightened her lips and forced it still, desperately holding on to the promise her father had made. She was still waiting. Rafael Flores had already accepted that he was going to die. It wasn't a dramatic acceptance, nor did it come with some grand ceremony or deep resolve. He had simply followed the cold logic available to a man with no more choices, and had reached the conclusion that his own life was the last thing he possessed that Armani Douglas had not yet taken. And if giving that life away meant Clara would come home to safety, If it meant she would walk back into her grandmother's house, sleep in a proper bed, eat a warm meal, and finally be allowed to be a little girl again, then the trade seemed perfectly clear. He sat on the thin mattress of the cot in the room where they were holding him and mentally went over the bargain he was preparing to make. He would offer everything he knew, every single name, every secret location, every single deal he had ever been a part of since the very beginning. He would lay it all out for them, complete and total, in return for just one thing: his daughter, home by tonight. He had nearly managed to convince himself that it was a strategy instead of a total surrender when the door swung open. The man who came into the room was not one of Armani's people. Raphael knew this instantly, not because he recognized the face, he did not, but because of the way the man entered. Armani's men either banged on the door or didn't, but they always entered with a very specific kind of energy. It was the simmering hostility of men who needed you to be aware of your position at all times. They always reminded you of the true nature of your arrangement. This new man simply entered the room. He walked in the way a person walks into a space they have already determined is theirs. He was composed, moving without haste, and he assessed the entire room with one look before his eyes came to rest on Raphael. Raphael Flores, he stated. It was not a question. Raphael got to his feet with caution. Who are you? I was sent to find you. The man walked over to the window and surveyed the street below with an expert's glance before turning back. You have a daughter, Clara. She is 7 years old. A knot of ice formed in Raphael's chest. Where is she? Tell me, is she okay? She is safe. The man's tone was so devoid of emotion that it was somehow more believable than any attempt at reassurance could ever have been. This was not a man offering comfort. He was providing a fact. She has been taken from Douglas's possession. I need you to leave with me now. Raphael could only stare at him. Who sent you? He asked again. The man's gaze was unwavering. Valentino Sanz. The name dropped into the small room like a heavy stone cast into quiet water. Raphael had heard that name before, just as everyone in their city had, always in hushed tones and indirect references. It was never spoken directly or with any volume. It was the kind of name that was used in conversation as a landmark rather than a topic, the way one might refer to a mountain range or a powerful storm. Something immense and undeniable that fundamentally altered the world around it without needing to be discussed. He never imagined that name would have any connection to his own life. Why? Raphael asked, his voice careful. Why would Valentino Sanz send somebody to look for me? Your daughter silently formed 3 words for him in a parking lot earlier today. The man's face remained a mask of neutrality. He was able to understand her. That is everything you need to know for the time being. Raphael sank back down onto the cot's edge. He covered his face with both of his hands and remained that way for a very long time. He was not weeping or speaking. He was just breathing. He was breathing inside the profound and crushing relief of a man who had been forced to carry a truly impossible burden and had just been told, with no warning at all, that someone else had just taken hold of the other side. His shoulders trembled once. He composed himself, lowered his hands from his face, and rose to his feet. Take me to my daughter, he said. Elsewhere in the city, Valentino's teams were operating with the seamless precision of men who had performed this kind of task for so long it had become instinctual. There were 2 separate teams, taking 2 separate routes. The first team was tracking Armani's alternate safe houses, the kind of places men like Armani used to keep people when they were needed, close by, but utterly off the grid. The other team was running Raphael's name through the vast web of contacts and sources that Valentino had spent 2 decades carefully building in this exact city. It was built for this exact kind of problem. It took them only 40 minutes to locate him. Valentino got the confirmation on his cellular phone and read the message without showing any emotion. He put the phone back in his pocket and looked across the parking lot to where Clara was sitting in the back of one of his cars. The door was open, and one of his men stood nearby at a polite distance. Someone had given her a bottle of water and a jacket that was much warmer than the coat that had been drowning her. She was sitting with her knees pressed together, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and she was gazing out of the open door at nothing at all. She had not made a single request. She had not uttered a single complaint. She had just continued to wait with that same unnerving and terribly sad patience for whatever was going to happen next. Valentino observed her for a moment longer. He had rescued people from bad situations in the past. It was a regular part of his business. Influence and power could shift in any direction, and sometimes it served his own purposes to help redirect that flow. He never once made the mistake of thinking this was charity. Every move was strategic. Every action was a calculation. The morality of any of it was purely a side effect. He repeated this assurance to himself now, his eyes fixed on the child sitting perfectly still in the back seat of his car, her hands clasped together. The thought did not entirely comfort him. Armani was being kept in the type of comfortable prison that Valentino favored for these situations. There was no physical force, no outright intimidation, just the overwhelming presence of disciplined men occupying a tight space until any thought of movement became purely academic. He had been allowed to make 2 phone calls. He had also been given food to eat. Crucially, he had not been physically harmed. Valentino understood that this absence of violence was a message in itself. Men who only wanted to scare you would hurt you right away. Men who held genuine power over you had no need for such theatrics. They simply laid out the unchangeable facts of the situation and then waited for you to finally accept them. According to the man watching him, Armani had stopped fighting the reality of his position about 20 minutes earlier. The supervisor had put it simply. He just went quiet. That was good. Quiet was a sign of calculation, and calculation meant that Armani was already searching for the path of least resistance, the one that would cost him the least. This ensured that when Valentino finally sat down with him, their discussion would be direct and productive. But that talk was scheduled for later. At this very moment, a different car was speeding across the city. Inside was Rafael Flores, a man who was beaten, his eyes sunken and hollow, unwashed for 3 days, running solely on the desperate energy of a father who had yet to see his daughter again. He was heading toward the street where Clara was waiting patiently. Valentino's man in that car had sent a single potent update. The message read, "He has not stopped shaking since we confirmed she is safe." Valentino absorbed the words, placed his phone face down on the car's hood, and looked up. The sky above the district was a deep amber as the last light of day bled into a darker, more silent evening. He found himself thinking about what Clara said after he told her how brave she had been, and how her chin had trembled just once. She had steadied it almost immediately, a 7-year-old girl holding her father's promise together with all her strength. Just hold on, he thought, a message directed at no one and everyone at once. He is almost here. The car transporting Rafael Flores finally appeared at 6:47 in the evening. Valentino knew the exact time, not because he was impatient, but from the deep-seated habit of a man who grasped that timing was its own form of power. He knew the order in which things unfolded was as significant as the events themselves. He had orchestrated this sequence with great care. First Armani was secured, then Raphael was brought in, and finally, Clara would be revealed at the exact moment when the power dynamic in the room had been completely remade. Order was everything. Control was everything. He reminded himself of these principles as the car rolled into the parking lot. When Rafael Flores climbed out, Valentino took his measure in a single, comprehensive glance. He looked to be 40, maybe 42 years old, with a medium height and a slender frame, the kind of physique earned through years of physical labor. It was a body built for function, not for show. His face was covered in 3 days of stubble, and his expression showed a weariness that went deeper than simple exhaustion. The corner of his left eye was swollen shut, with a bruise turning a sickly yellow as it spread down his cheekbone. His lip had been cut open and had started to heal poorly over the last few days. He moved with the cautious, deliberate gait of a person nursing ribs that had recently met a hard object. He had been hurt. It was not a savage beating, as Armani had wanted his cooperation, not his incapacitation, but it was enough to make it clear that their business arrangement was very real. Yet, what captured Valentino's attention most were his eyes. They darted instantly, instinctively, scanning every corner of the lot in a frantic sequence. This was not the trained observation of someone used to danger. It was something more primal, more animalistic. He was searching for his daughter. Valentino took a step forward. "She is here," he said, his voice calm and steady. "She is safe. You will see her in just a few minutes." Raphael's head snapped toward him. Something in his tightly controlled expression began to fracture at this confirmation. It was like a hairline crack appearing on the surface of a man who had been holding himself together by sheer force of will and was now, for the first time in 3 agonizing days, being given permission to let go. He pressed his lips into a thin line and gave a short nod. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice rough and barely working. "Do not thank me yet," Valentino replied. "We have something we need to conclude first." Armani was escorted out 2 minutes later. He entered the parking lot with the restrained composure of someone who had done all the math, settled on his strategy, and was determined to see it through with a measure of dignity. His shirt was remarkably neat. His face was a mask of control. He looked over at Raphael with the same flat, appraising stare a creditor gives a debtor. A look so habitual and reflexive, it suggested the last few hours had not fundamentally changed their power dynamic at all. Then, his gaze shifted to Valentino. The carefully constructed composure showed a slight crack. "Let's get this resolved," Armani stated, his voice tight. "Yes," Valentino agreed smoothly. "Let us do that." He deliberately placed himself directly between the two other men. He was not there to mediate or to facilitate an agreement. He was simply claiming the center of the space, making it undeniably clear who had called this meeting and who was in absolute control of it. "The debt," Valentino began, his eyes fixed on Armani. "What was the original amount?" Armani stated the figure. Valentino then turned his gaze to Raphael. Raphael confirmed it with one single weary nod, the gesture of a man who was far beyond any attempt at deception. "The job you declined," Valentino continued, his tone unchanging. "Describe it to me." Armani's jaw clenched. "That is not relevant to this." "Describe it." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Finally, Armani described the job. Valentino listened to the entire story without a single interruption. When Armani was done, Valentino remained quiet for a beat, not because he was thinking it over. He already knew the basic details from what his men had gathered in the hours prior. He was merely letting the ugly description of the task hang in the open air, putting it on display where all three of them could inspect it properly. "You ordered him to take part in a violent interception," Valentino stated, his voice flat. "He refused to do so. Your response was to take his daughter." He held Armani's gaze without blinking. "That is not a simple business disagreement. That is a serious crime, and it was committed inside my territory against a civilian family. You do see the difference, do you not?" Armani's face was stone. "The debt is legitimate. The debt is not the issue here." Valentino's voice was as level as a blade. "Your methods are the issue. You escalated a financial matter into the abduction of a young child. That completely changes what you are entitled to." Armani just stared at him. "You are restructuring my agreement." "I am defining the terms you are permitted to enforce," Valentino corrected. He then looked at Raphael. "The original amount. It will be paid in cash installments over the next 18 months, on a schedule that his income can actually support. There will be no more jobs, no other arrangements. He will have no further involvement in any operations." He shifted his focus back to Armani. "You will collect the money, And that is all. This family is to be considered off limits, starting right now. Armani's eyes narrowed. And the alternative? That is not the alternative, Valentino said softly, the quiet in his voice more menacing than a shout. The alternative is that I declare what you did here today to be a major breach of territorial conduct, and then I will respond accordingly. He let the words settle. You are fully aware of what accordingly entails. The parking lot was deathly quiet. High up in the concrete structure above them, a car's engine started, then its sound faded away into the night. The final hint of amber had vanished from the sky, replaced by a cool, deep blue. The overhead floodlights had flickered to life, bathing the entire scene in a stark, even light that offered no shadows to hide in. Armani stood frozen in the middle of it all, running the calculations in his head one last time. The outcome had not changed. It was never going to change. Valentino's men were in position. His own security detail had been completely neutralized. They had not been harmed, merely redirected elsewhere, a fact that was somehow more profoundly humiliating than if they had been beaten. There was no possible version of this event where using force would lead to a better result for him. There was no escape route. There were only the terms being offered. He finally let out a slow breath through his nose. 18 months, he said, the words clipped. 18 months, Valentino confirmed. And the family is completely clear. The family is clear, Valentino repeated. Armani stared at Raphael for a long, hard moment, his expression that of a man committing to memory a debt that was no longer about money. Then he tore his eyes away. Fine, he bit out. Valentino turned to the man standing at his right and gave a single, decisive nod. That man walked over to the car where Clara had been waiting and opened the rear passenger door. She climbed out. She stood there at the edge of the lit pavement, looking pale and impossibly small in her oversized coat under the flat glare of the overhead lights, and her eyes scanned across the asphalt. Raphael saw her. Whatever had been keeping him upright, the desperate necessity, the sharp focus, the absolute requirement to remain functional during the meeting, it all shattered completely and instantly. It was like the release of a breath held for too long, like a fist unclenching after being gripped for hours. He covered the distance between them in 5 huge strides and fell to his knees on the pavement in front of her. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her tight. Clara buried her face deep into his shoulder. For a long, silent moment, neither of them moved or spoke. Valentino watched the scene unfold from where he stood. He did not look away. In his mind, Rafael Flores had lived this exact moment about 10,000 times over the past 3 days. He had not dared to think about the logistics of it, because logistics required a belief that this moment would ever actually happen. At certain points over the previous 72 hours, that kind of belief had felt more like a form of torture than a source of comfort. But he had allowed himself to imagine the feeling of it, the specific, familiar weight of his daughter in his arms, the way she always tucked her head against him when she was tired or afraid, the scent of her hair, the unique way she sounded when she wept. Never loudly, she was never loud, but with a tiny gasping sound she had made since she was a baby, a sound he could pick out of a crowded hall with his eyes shut. He had imagined this feeling 10,000 times, yet it still hit him with the force of something entirely new. She was so very small. That was the first thing that broke him. He was aware that she was small. She was only 7. Being small was her natural state. But 3 full days of horrifying daydreams had somehow magnified her in his imagination, making her seem larger, as if the sheer weight of his terror had physically transferred to her. But now, holding her, she was just his little girl, tiny and solid and here. He buried his face in her hair and felt the tremors begin deep in his own chest, the kind of profound shaking that happens when a man's body is finally given permission to feel what his mind had been blocking for 72 straight hours. His arms wrapped more tightly around her. He was careful not to crush her, even now, even in this moment, but he held her as close as he possibly could. "I am so sorry," he whispered. The words came out with frayed edges. He had intended to say something more meaningful, something that would do justice to this moment, something that might start to close the gap between the nightmare he had put her through and the safety she truly deserved. But he could not find those words right now. There was only this, only the two words that had been building like a dam inside him for 3 long days. "I am so sorry. I am so, so sorry, my baby. I am sorry." Clara's little arms were wrapped around his neck. She did not answer right away. She just let him hold her, let him repeat his apology, and she breathed against his shoulder with a calm that was both incredible and devastating in a child of her size and age. Then, she spoke quietly into the material of his jacket. "I did what you told me to do." Raphael leaned back just enough to see her face. Her eyes, her eyes were bone dry. She had not cried once. Not in his presence, anyway. Not yet. Her face held the same calm, guarded look he had noticed from across the parking lot 3 long days ago. It was the same expression she wore when Armani presented her as a bargaining chip, an expression that had been tearing him apart in his memory ever since. He searched her face for any sign of the damage, for the piece of her that these days had stolen, the part of her spirit he might never get back. "I know you did," was all he could say. "I know you were incredibly brave. You told me to listen," she replied. "You promised you would fix it. I know, so I did what you said." She stated it as a simple fact, as if the logic was undeniable, as if trusting him completely, as if her obedience had been the easiest thing in the world. But it had cost her everything, and she was handing that trust to him now like a precious gift. Raphael choked out a sound that wasn't a word and pulled her into another hug. And this time she allowed it, her small hands clutching the back of his jacket. The sheer force of her grip told him more about her terror than her words ever could. She had hidden her fear, but it had been her constant companion the entire time. Valentino observed this from the edge of the scene, keeping his distance. He had deliberately placed himself close enough to see everything, but far enough away to grant them their private moment. His men had mirrored his action, a silent retreat by people who understood when their presence was required and when their absence was essential. He watched Raphael embrace his daughter under the harsh, flat lights of the parking garage. In his profession, in his world, he had seen many reunions. Possessions were taken and then returned. The act of returning was always a transaction, a business deal completed, a ledger balanced, a debt settled. The human emotion involved was just incidental, nothing more than background noise. He had never struggled to keep himself separate from it before. Tonight, however, he was finding that separation a little more difficult to maintain. He could not say for certain what had changed. The fundamental situation was not new to him. A child being used for leverage. In the world he lived in, this was not unheard of. He had handled the problem using the same methods he always used to resolve conflicts: careful positioning, precise calculation, and applying the right amount of pressure at exactly the right time. The plan had unfolded perfectly, just as he had designed it. So this strange feeling that now resided in his chest made no logical sense. He examined it with the same detached curiosity he used for most things that did not fit into his established understanding of the world. It was not exactly discomfort, but it was not satisfaction either. It was something in between, a quiet, low vibration just beneath his breastbone that he could not immediately name. He was still trying to analyze the sensation when he heard the sound of small footsteps. Clara was walking straight toward him. Raphael had made a move to follow her. Valentino noticed the automatic, protective gesture as he leaned forward, but something in Clara's determined posture must have told her father that she needed to do this alone, because Raphael stopped. He slowly straightened up and simply watched his daughter go. She crossed the pavement between them with a steady pace. She came to a halt directly in front of Valentino and looked up at him. just as she had done across the parking lot earlier that day. Her gaze was direct, calm, and asked for nothing. He looked down at her. "I was not sure if you were safe," she said. Valentino just watched her. "What do you mean by that?" "When you blocked the road," she explained, choosing her words very carefully. "He got so angry. I was not sure if you would be okay." Something inside Valentino's chest shifted. She had been worried. In the midst of her own ordeal, the terror, the exhaustion, the 3 days of holding her fear inside, she had still made room to be worried about him. "I was fine," he told her. His voice was softer than he had intended. She nodded her head, accepting his answer. Then she looked right at him with those pale, clear eyes. "Why did you help?" she asked him. "You did not have to do that." He remained silent for a long moment. "No," he finally said. "I did not." She appeared to think about his response. Then, with the unique seriousness that only a 7-year-old can have, she delivered a conclusion that she had clearly arrived at through careful thought. "You have the look of someone who does not look away." Valentino held her gaze. For 20 years, in this city and in this life, powerful men had called him many names. They were afraid of him, they avoided him. They gave him respect born from caution and self-interest, the kind of respect people give to things that can destroy them. But no one had ever seen him in this way before. He did not answer right away because, for the first time in a very long time, he had no idea what to say. Valentino did not find any sleep that night. This was not out of the ordinary for him. Sleep was always a fragile truce, something he approached with caution and left with ease. He never truly surrendered to it the way he saw other people do. His mind never shut down on command. It was always working, cataloging events, assessing threats, running through possible scenarios, and filing away critical details. It had been this way since he was 19 years old, after a very specific and brutal lesson taught him that the world shows no mercy to the unprepared. Tonight, however, the mental cataloging felt different. He sat in the private office of his building on K Meridian, his personal fortress on his street, in the district that everyone in the city connected with his name. He was not reviewing financial records or evaluating his operations or planning out the coming week. He just sat there with a glass of water he hadn't touched, thinking about a 7-year-old girl who told him he looked like someone who does not look away. He turned her sentence over and over in his mind, studying it from every possible angle. It was like discovering a strange object and trying to figure out what it is and where it came from. He had built his entire reputation on one specific, unwavering principle. It was not cruelty. Cruelty was inefficient, and Valentino valued efficiency above all else. It was not exactly fear either, even though fear was a common result of his work. The principle was much simpler and far more reliable than either of those things. It was clarity. He was always clear about his intentions and his actions. He was clear about his demands and what he would tolerate. He was clear about the boundaries that governed his world and the consequences for crossing them. That clarity was his true power. Everything else was just for show. What he was confronting tonight was a new boundary. It was not new in the sense of a feeling he had not had before. Some lines should never be crossed. Using a child to control their parents was one of them. It was a tactic for the weak, a sign of cowardice that Valentino had always despised in private. It was a personal distaste he never allowed in his own organization. But a quiet preference is not the same as a strict command. An event earlier that night had changed everything. At 11:30, he made the call. His senior man picked up before the first ring finished, a habit formed over 11 years of service. He waited in silence, knowing that calls this late were for orders, not conversation. His only job was to listen and to understand. Valentino's voice was calm but absolute. "I want the word sent out," he said. "Any operation under my authority, any territory under my protection, will no longer use family members as instruments. Not wives, not parents. He paused, letting the weight of the command settle. And never children. A moment of silence passed over the line. It is understood, the man finally said. The rule was now law. I want it made perfectly clear to everyone who works here now, to anyone who wants to work here in the future, and especially to Armani Douglas. He glanced at the full glass of water on his desk. If this happens again, by anyone, our protection is over. Completely. I will make sure the message is out by morning. Tonight, Valentino corrected him. Tonight, the man confirmed without hesitation. The call was over. The news spread the way that important news always spread in this city. It did not come through official announcements or public declarations. It flowed through the quiet, hidden channels of people who knew that information was a form of currency, and that an instruction from Valentino was not a suggestion. By midnight, the message had already reached the three other major organizations that operated in the neighboring districts. By 2 in the morning, it had trickled down to the secondary networks, the smaller outfits, the freelancers, and the men who worked on the fringes of the underworld. By the time the sun came up, it was an established fact. In Valentino's territory, children were not to be touched. Reactions were varied. Some men accepted the news with sincere relief. There were people in this world who did this work out of necessity, not desire. Men who had their own unstated rules and had just never been in a position to enforce them. Others took the news with the detached neutrality of professionals who were busy recalculating their strategies. A small minority received it with the quiet anger of men whose favorite tactics had just been taken away. But not a single one of them dared to argue against it. Armani Douglas got the message in writing. It was a single page, written in precise language, outlining the new terms of his restructured debt and his repayment schedule. The final paragraph left no room for misunderstanding. The Flores family was now untouchable. Any approach, any surveillance, or any attempt to revive the original deal would be considered a direct breach of the new agreement made on Kaya Meridian. The penalties were not listed. They did not have to be. Armani put his signature on the document. Valentino had it filed away. Rafael Flores, however, received a different type of message. It was not on paper, and it was delivered in person by the same quiet man who had driven him across the city the previous night. The terms were simple. The debt was still there, but its entire structure had been changed. The payments were now manageable, and there was no further involvement or special arrangements required. His daughter's name would never again be mentioned in any conversation related to any business in the city, for as long as Valentino and his sons had the power to enforce it. Raphael listened to every word with the look of a man who was still trying to process the fact that he was alive, that he was unharmed, and that his daughter was safely home. Then he finally asked the one question that had been buried beneath all his other emotions since that night in the lot. Why did he do all this? The man thought about the question for a moment. He saw your daughter on his street, he answered, and he made a choice. Raphael nodded his head slowly. The man's words lingered with him for a very long time after he departed. Clara returned to school on Thursday. Raphael had offered to let her stay home for an extended period, perhaps a week, or even 2 weeks, whatever time she needed to feel ready. She had mulled over his offer with her typical solemnity, examining it from every angle the way she did with most important choices, and ultimately she declined. She was eager to go back. She missed her own desk, her teacher, the unique scent of the classroom in the early morning, and the distinct clamor of the playground during lunch. What she craved was normalcy. Raphael understood this perfectly. The ordinary rhythm of life was the very thing that had been stolen from them. Therefore, restoring that sense of ordinary was the most important mission. He personally walked her to and from school that entire first week, and on most days after that. It was a minor adjustment to his daily schedule, costing him 2 delivery runs each week. But he considered it, without a moment's hesitation, the single best investment he had ever made in his life. On that Friday evening, at the end of Clara's first week back in class, she was seated at the kitchen table, focused on her homework. Without lifting her eyes from the worksheet, she asked a simple question. Is Valentino a good person? Raphael stopped what he was doing. His mind flashed to the image of the man standing in the amber glow of the commercial lot. He remembered the tattoos, the profound stillness, and the absolute, unmistakable authority of someone who had lived for decades as the most formidable presence in any room he occupied. He recalled the blocked exit, the completely renegotiated debt, and the single sheet of paper bearing Armani's signature, which now rested in an envelope in the back of his desk drawer. He thought of Clara, walking across the asphalt toward that man with her small, unwavering steps. Raphael chose his words with great care. I think, he said, that he is a complicated person who made a very good decision. Clara thought about this, her pencil poised just above her worksheet. I think he is good, she stated with certainty. He just does not know it yet. Then she returned to her schoolwork. Raphael remained in the kitchen doorway, watching his daughter. She looked so small, so whole, so perfectly ordinary in the most wonderful way, hunched over a mathematics problem in the warm yellow light of their kitchen. He considered all that it had taken to reach this quiet moment, every poor choice he had made, every single compromise, every silent boundary he had crossed out of sheer necessity. He thought about the floor next to her empty bed, the unfamiliar phone, and the message that had taken her place. He remembered Valentino's sons steering a car sideways to block a narrow exit lane. Something settled deep in his chest. It was not absolution, not yet, and perhaps it never would be entirely, but it was something adjacent to peace. It felt quietly and cautiously like the beginning of moving forward. The envelope showed up on a Tuesday. Valentino's assistant set it on his desk without a word. It had been delivered to the building's main address, the front handwritten, with no return name. It was the kind of mail that, in his line of work, demanded a certain level of inspection before it was ever handled. His assistant had already checked it. It was clean, containing only paper and whatever else was inside. He stared at it for a moment before he opened it. The handwriting on the envelope was mature, but it was also meticulously careful, showing a slight effort. It was the script of someone who viewed letters as important and had pressed the pen a bit too hard while concentrating on forming them correctly for the man who blocked the road. There was no name, no return address, just that description. He opened it at his desk during his afternoon calls, in the 20-minute interval between the close of his business day and the start of whatever the evening held for him. He unfolded the single page inside with the deliberate care of a person handling an object that had arrived without warning from a realm of experience he did not typically face at his desk. There were 2 items inside. The first was a drawing created with colored pencils. It was the kind of careful, sincere art that occupies that unique space of a child attempting with great effort to capture something from the real world, rather than just filling a page with color. It depicted a street, drawn with the flattened perspective common in a child's art, but it also showed a specific focus on details that hinted the young artist had considered the scene with great care. A black car was parked sideways, blocking a lane. A tall figure in a dark suit stood beside it. There were lines on the figure's neck and hands, which were clearly an attempt to draw his tattoos. The face was more of an impression than a true portrait, yet it somehow conveyed something recognizable in the set of the jaw and the firmness of the posture. A small figure with blonde hair and an oversized coat stood nearby. Both of them were encircled by a large, slightly uneven sun radiating golden light. The second item was a short letter, written in the same careful, heavily pressed hand as the envelope. Dear man who blocked the road, my name is Clara. You helped me and my dad. I wanted to say thank you because my dad already said thank you, but I wanted to say it too because it was really me you helped. I was not scared of you. I want you to know that. Some people might be scared of you, but I was not. I thought you looked safe. And I was right. My dad is okay. I am okay. I go to school. I have a rabbit named Biscuit. I hope you are okay too. From Clara Flores. P.S. You should smile more. You have a nice face. Valentino read the letter 2 times. Then he placed it down on his desk and just looked at it. Outside his window, the city pulsed with the sounds of its evening traffic. He heard a door close somewhere below, the distant, compressed noise of ordinary life carrying on in all its usual directions. His phone vibrated once, signaling something that needed his immediate attention. He ignored it. He stared at the drawing, at the lopsided sun, the earnest attempt to capture his tattoos, and the two figures the child had placed together inside the golden light. He had received countless things at this desk over the years. He had seen documents, proposals, confessions, payments, and threats that were veiled in polite language, as well as apologies dressed in the very same disguise. He was familiar with the complete spectrum of what people brought to a man of his stature when they needed something from him, or owed something to him, or were terrified of what he might decide to do next. But he had never received a drawing. He had never received a letter from someone who simply wanted him to know they had not been afraid of him. Not because they were feigning courage, or because they needed him to believe it for some strategic purpose, but because it was the simple truth, and they felt he deserved to know it. He sat with the letter and the drawing for a long time. There was a peculiar feeling he had been carrying with him ever since that night on Kaya Meridian. It was that unnamed thing he had noticed in himself while watching Raphael embrace his daughter in the flat overhead lighting of the lot. A low, quiet vibration beneath his sternum that did not fit into any category he could name. He finally recognized it now. It was the feeling of having done something that held no strategic value, offered no leverage, and promised no return. It was an act that existed completely outside the framework of exchange and calculation that had dictated every choice he had made for 20 years. It was something he had done for the simple reason that a child had trusted him to do it. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk. It was not a drawer for sentimental items. It contained practical things, the tools of his trade, objects that had to be accessible but remain unseen. He moved these items aside without any ceremony. He carefully placed the letter and the drawing in the very back of the drawer. He then closed it. He picked up his phone and returned the call he had previously ignored. His voice, when he finally spoke, was the same as it always was, even, controlled, and carrying precisely the amount of weight it was meant to carry, and not an ounce more. But something deep inside him had shifted. It was not dramatic. It was not a change that would have been noticeable to the person on the other end of the phone call, or to anyone who might have seen him that evening, or to the larger world that knew his name and kept its distance as a result. It had just shifted, in the same way a compass needle shifts when it finds true north. It was a quiet, certain movement, pointing in a direction it had not pointed to before. Power, Valentino had learned at a young age, was a story that other people told about you. You could not build it directly. You created the conditions for it, made the decisions, established the conduct, and enforced the lines that were held. Power was the narrative that then formed around those conditions. It was like sediment slowly accumulating around a fixed point in a moving river, gradual, patient, and permanent. He had understood this principle at 19 years old, and had been building his life accordingly ever since. What he had not understood until this moment was that the story other people told about you was not always the story that held the most significance, not after the Kaya Meridian lot. Model, it began with an obvious injustice in a sun-baked parking lot. A father named Rafael Flores stood powerless, watching two men guide his daughter Clara into the back of a dark sport utility vehicle. This was how business was done. A debt was owed, and a child was the collateral. This is the first lesson of a hard world. True power is the only thing that can offer protection. Raphael had none. The question that hung in the stifling air was whether anyone did. You will want to stay to see how this question gets answered. The air inside the truck was thick and hot, smelling of old plastic and stale smoke. Clara sat on the seat, her small legs not reaching the floor, her knuckles white as she clutched a stuffed rabbit. Outside, her father's face was a mask of pure terror, his body rigid with a helplessness that was agonizing to watch. He was exhausted, worn down by fear and the relentless pressure of his debt. In that moment, surrounded by asphalt and indifferent cars, they were completely and utterly alone, a tiny island of despair in a world that had forgotten them. Then, a black sedan moved with quiet purpose, blocking the only exit lane. The engine went silent. A man named Valentino stepped out. The two collectors froze, their casual menace evaporating into stark fear. Valentino was a dangerous man, and they were his men. But his gaze did not fall on them. It went past them, to the window of the SUV, to the small girl inside. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a threat. A strange calm settled over the scene, and for the first time, the crushing weight of fear on Raphael's chest lifted just enough to let in a breath of impossible hope. In that instant, Valentino recognized a rot that had spread through his own operations. This was not strength. It was a lazy, cheap cruelty that had become an accepted tool. He saw a system that had failed. His name was meant to provide a brutal kind of order, but it had been twisted into a shield for bullies who terrorized children. He suddenly saw a long line of invisible victims, other families crushed under the same corrupt logic. This one girl, Clara, made him see all the others he had allowed to suffer in his blindness. The justice he delivered was not loud, but it was absolute. The debt was restructured into small, fair payments Raphael could actually manage. The men who had used a child as a pawn were stripped of their standing, their power gone in an instant. The ultimate wrongdoer lost his protection. As the black sedan pulled away, Rafael Flores fell to his knees on the hot asphalt and held his daughter as if he might never let go. The ordeal was over, and their recovery could begin. In this quiet moment of victory, a path to hope was finally cleared. The moral of that day spread like a quiet flood through the district. A new rule was now understood by everyone. Children were not to be touched. This principle held strong, not just from fear of consequences, but because the act itself communicated something more profound. It showed there was a line, and the man who drew it did so from a place of conviction, not cold strategy. In the following weeks, several men approached Valentino privately. They spoke in the careful, roundabout language of men unused to such conversations, telling him they were glad for the rule. They had been waiting for someone with the authority to finally declare that some things are not for sale. The story people told later was always incomplete. They spoke of the blocked exit, the quiet standoff, and the new rule that brought a different kind of order. What the story missed was the letter tucked away in the bottom drawer of Valentino's desk, with a child's drawing of a lopsided sun. It said, "I was not scared of you. I thought you looked safe. I was right." The story could not capture the powerful, unnamed emotion that moved in his chest as he watched a 7-year-old girl walk toward him with steady steps, worried about his safety. He was not sure he was a good man, but he was finally thinking about it. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. You are the reason these stories feel alive. If you are ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I am excited to read your thoughts and connect with you in the comments. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories and valuable life lessons to our audience. Thank you for listening.